Well, thank you for to be here by the invitation of the Communicantes Foundation, and I'm really grateful for bringing me here. Well, coming from the west, well, very far west, I mean California, and between California and Asia, I find myself here just like in the center of the world. And this is a very happy feeling. I'd like to share with you tonight some insights from from my experiences in the church, in the Eastern Christianity, but also from my very recent book, Political Orthodoxies, which was published a couple of months ago, where I explored in more detail the way how politics and religion interact with one another, especially in the realm of the Eastern Christianity. And my argument is that that interaction is not unique. It fits the framework, the more general framework of religion, politics in the global context. And one of the frames that I explore is the frame of ideology. And I'd like to bring to our discussion today this topic of ideology, and to invite you to discuss it together, maybe through the Q&A in the end, how ideology and theology are related to one another. My basic hypothesis and presupposition is that ideology and theology are different on the one hand, and even adversary to one another. At the same time, they are related to one another. Their relation is more like father and son, and in a very peculiar way, maybe in the Oedipian sense, when one generation tries to kill another one, and they are at odds with one another. I would argue that ideology is a secularized theology. They were born, they emerged as incompatible with one another, and later on they came to be similar to one another, to the extent that sometimes ideology gets disguised for theology, and the other time theology gets disguised for ideology, and sometimes they constitute very strange alliances, which I'd like to explore in more detail in the end of my presentation. So I will tell you more about the genesis, the origins of ideology as a phenomenon. We'll try to put it into a relationship with theology, explore the instances when they interfere with one another, and then we'll invite you to think if they should stay together or they should be separated. I believe that this topic is very much a European. It is relevant to the general framework of the discussions here. Speaking about the soul of Europe, ideologies have become a sort of an intrinsic part of the soul of Europe somehow. And modern Europe, in the beginning of the Enlightenment project, produced ideology as a genre, and since then, ideologies have framed the soul and the mind of Europe. Therefore, it's important to go back to the origins and to explore how ideologies emerged. The very term was coined by a French philosopher, Antoine de Tracy. He is not very well known, but he was one of those French who articulated to a great extent the Enlightenment project. And actually the word comes from the title of his main work, which was published in 5 volumes in the beginning of the 19th century, and was known as Les éléments d'idéologie. The point of de Tracy was that ideology is an alternative to religion. It is an alternative to theology. De Tracy constructed ideology, the concept of ideology, as a secular mindset, as a secular outlook, which provides an alternative to the religious outlook. From the very beginning, it was a secular phenomenon, and it was envisaged by the Tracy as a secular phenomenon, and it was supposed to be contrasting the religious outlook. So in the very beginning, theology and ideology were perceived as a completely different phenomena that should stay away from one another and should exclude one another. Ideology, in other words, excluded theology, and theology was supposed to exclude ideology as well. This eventually this started the evolution of ideology. So ideology evolved as a phenomenon, as a concept, as an idea, and it evolved into a philosophical mindset, into a culture, if you want, of philosophy, and particularly idealistic philosophy. In some sense, de Tracy, even though he was not himself a prominent philosopher of the same rank as Kant or Hegel, he gave an explanation, a wording, to describe what was the German idealistic philosophy. And eventually ideology became associated with the German, particularly with the German idealistic philosophy, given that even the core word, the root of the word, idea, is the same. Ideology is about ideas, and ideas were perceived as the main driving force of the world from the perspective of the German idealistic philosophy. And exactly in this capacity, ideology was criticized by Karl Marx. His attitude to ideology was very critical. He believed that ideology, especially as it was articulated, as it was used by the idealist philosophers of the previous generation before him, was misleading. It was wrong. It led people to a wrong perception of the reality. While de Tracy wanted ideology to lead people to the true perception of the reality, in his understanding, the true perception of reality was free of religion, of the religious perception. De Tracy believed that religious perception is wrong. What he suggested as an ideology was a correct perception of the reality. Exactly, Karl Marx criticized this alternative which was suggested by de Tracy, and he suggested another way of receiving reality, not through the prism of ideas, but through the prism of economic interests and class struggle, and, well, you know what constitutes the core of the Marxist doctrine. So effectively, Marx criticized ideologies of the previous generation, and his intention was to produce something which was different from ideologies, a better, a healthier, a more adequate perception of the world. But, as we know all, what he wanted to produce as an alternative to ideology ended up as an ideology. And this has become an intrinsic feature of ideologies, of all ideologies. I would exemplify this feature by a famous play by a Soviet playwright, Evgeny Schwartz. Probably you've heard about this playwright. He lived in the times of Stalin, and his most famous play is called The Dragon. The main idea of this play is the following: that in a certain city there is a dragon who kills people, who demands human lives, and there is a dragon hunter. There are many dragon hunters who try to kill the dragon. And what happens to those dragon hunters? The moment they kill the dragon, they turn to a dragon themselves. So that is kind of I found this image of dragon hunters killing dragons and turning to dragons themselves very descriptive of ideologies. They try to kill their preceding ideologies, and eventually they become ideologies themselves. That was the case with with Marx, who wanted to kill the dragon of the ideology of the previous generation of philosophers before him. And what he produced turned to an even more monstrous ideology. I will come in a few minutes to what happened to those ideologies who tried to kill the ideology of Marxism and others. And as I mentioned, Marx produced a more monstrous ideology, and that ideology we knew very well from our personal experience in the Soviet Union, the ideology of communism, which became a totalitarian ideocracy. And Nazism, as we know, fascism and Nazism developed as a rejection of that ideology, and at the same time they were very similar, like on this picture. They constituted the two sides of the same coin, effectively. And this similarity between the ideology of Marxism or communism, its concrete incarnation in the Soviet ideology, and fascism, Nazism. So these two, the similarity between them was noticed by some European philosophers, thinkers, as early as in the 30s. And then they coined a word for those two ideologies, a common denominator for them. Even though they seemed to be irreconcilable, they were enemies to one another, they tried to extinguish one another, still they were very similar. And the word or the notion which was applied to them in common was the notion of political religion. Why political religion? They didn't pretend to do anything with religion. Well, communism rejected religion. Fascism and Nazism played with religion, tried to abuse religion in different ways. At the same time, what they produced, the systems of thought, of belief, resembled religion, because people believed in those ideologies in the same way as people believe in God, in the same way as people uphold religions. They were ready to sacrifice themselves for the sake of their religion, and they were ready to sacrifice others for the sake of their religion. As we know, the numbers of sacrifices that they made for the sake of their religions outnumbered by far the victims of all religious wars before the secular age. And those victims, those sacrifices were made in the name of those political religions, in the name of the intrinsically secular phenomena, I would say, which had nothing to do with religion per se, but as secular phenomena they were perceived by their followers as a religion. So those two secular phenomena, communism and Nazism, they led eventually to the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, with the most victims in the entire human history. It just came to my mind. A few months ago, I had a chance to visit Auschwitz in Poland, known also as Oswiecim. And quite surprising, we all have our own ideas about Auschwitz, right? That it is a horrible place. It is indeed a horrible place. But what struck me, what I observed there, was the following, an observation, that the way how Nazis treated Jews and those who were in Auschwitz was not very much different from the way how sometimes animals are treated, in farms. I saw those barracks, where they kept their victims, and they were like farms. So they treated human beings as animals, and they just slaughtered them. They fed them as far as they could. They used them to work, and then when they didn't need them, they just slaughtered them. For me, that represented the essence of this secular, in a very bad sense, secular attitude to human beings, which have been dehumanized, which became dehumanized, which represented this outlook at the human beings, which lacks completely the religious dimension, religious attitude. It is purely biological attitude to human beings, with all those experiments, with all those inhuman treatment of people. Again, don't perceive me wrong, that I'm not against secularism. I believe in secularism. I believe it's a very good thing, and it can help a lot, and I will come in the end to this conclusion. But there are some bad overturns of secularism, which can lead exactly to Auschwitz, which can lead exactly to the two, and which actually led to the two largest ideologies of the 20th century that ended up in the largest human killings in the human history. This has been summarized. I like this summary, which was made about the ideologies by Isaiah Berlin. I like this quote, and I'd like to read it. He referred to those two most important, most powerful ideologies of the 20th century, and he said, when our descendants in 2 or 3 centuries' time, if mankind survives until then, he was not very much optimistic, come to look at our age, it is these two phenomena, meaning communism and Nazism, that will, I think, be held to be the outstanding characteristics of our century. 20th century, he meant, the most demanding of explanation and analysis. But it is as well to realize that these great movements began with ideas in people's heads, ideas about what relations between men have been, are, might be, and should be, and to realize how they came to be transformed into the name of a vision of some supreme goal in the minds of the leaders, above all of the prophets, with armies at their backs. Well, the key word here is I believe, is the prophets. So those ideologies, inhuman ideologies, were invented, envisaged by prophets with the armies behind their backs, and that prophetic vision led the humankind to the tragedies. So this prophetic vision is a part of this ideological outlook, I believe, and ideologies in this sense, they failed dramatically. The churches, however, even though ideologies in this sense, they had a genealogy going back to, well, if you want, to the Tracy in some sense, to the times when ideology was invented in order to replace religion, the churches nevertheless came to collaborate with those ideologies and came to accept those ideologies. And eventually we know so many instances that the churches collaborated with the bad guys, with the bad regimes, with those inhuman prophecies, like the German Christians, of course. In the Orthodox world, it was the same. Look at those sweet kisses of the Greek hierarchs with the Greek dictators. So it is another instance, another example, illustration of how the church embraced ideologies. Oh, this one, another Greek hierarch hailing together with another Greek dictator, saluting the same set of ideas. Or this one in Romania, the Iron Guard, which was very closely associated with the church, and actually in the interwar period, Romania has produced a very interesting symbiosis of religion and ideology. This sort of symbiosis ruled the country. The country was at that time a one-party regime, the Romanian country, and it was a legionary country with the one party, the so-called party of the Legion of Archangel Michael, which was supported, backed, and by clergy, and actually a lot of clergy participated in that legion. And this is another interesting example of how the church merged with ideologies, even though, I want to stress it again, originally they were incompatible, and they were not supposed to be compatible. compatible. They were not supposed to be even standing, close to one another. And at the same time, they merged in the 20th century to constitute one thing. And this was a feature, just like totalitarianism was a feature of Europe in the beginning in the first half of the 20th century. And we know that only a few democracies existed in Europe at the time. Dictatorship was much more popular in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. And the same popular was the merge, the collaboration between the church and ideologies. Well, just another example of the churches accepting and endorsing Nazism. This is an interesting quote from the primate of the Russian Church outside Russia, where he praised, his name was Anastasy Gribanovsky, where he praised Hitler. Because Hitler actually, in Berlin, Hitler built and, allowed to be built a huge cathedral of the Russian Orthodox Church in Berlin, and for that purpose, the Russian Church praised a very particular part of the Russian Church, the part that emigrated to the West, while the other part of the Russian Church that stayed in the Soviet Union praised Stalin, as we know, and supported the regime that almost had extinguished the Church. So the Moscow Patriarchate in the Soviet Union, as we know, issued a declaration in 1927 where it declared loyalty to the Soviet regime. And at the time, Metropolitan Sergei Starogorodsky wrote that your joy is ours, addressing the Communist Party, and your victories are also ours. So, even though the ideologies were very different, communism and Nazism, sometimes they were endorsed by the same church. One part of the church endorsed the communist ideology in the Soviet Union, another part of the same church, which immigrated to the West, endorsed the antipode, the opposite of that ideology. All this led to the catastrophe of the war. All this led to the Holocaust, to the millions of victims in the wars, and those catastrophes, that catastrophe of the world, urged people, especially in Europe, to question the very concept of ideology. Whether ideology is something good. Yes, it constituted an intrinsic part of the Enlightenment project. At the same time, is it worthy to keep it? Because it had led to such catastrophes. Those questions were asked in the 40s and in the late 40s and in the 50s. And in relation to those questions, there was a famous book published in 1960 by a prominent American intellectual, Daniel Bell. The book was titled "The End of Ideology: On the Exhaustion of Political Ideas in the 50s." I really like this book, and I even put the title of this book to the title of my presentation because it was a landmark study. Daniel Bell argued that the ideologies as they had existed since the Enlightenment up to the World War II exhausted themselves. They were not relevant to the European project or to the Western project anymore. They failed. They led the humankind to fiasco. And this was, I think, a correct statement. Daniel Bell exactly identified the problem of the European soul or the Western soul. Ideology as a phenomenon, a secular phenomenon in a bad sense, not in a good sense, secular phenomenon, which can lead to Holocaust and other tragedies. A bit later, just really 5-6 years later, this famous issue of the Time magazine was published, and you probably know this title. It has, by the Los Angeles Times named this title the most recognizable magazine title in the history of print, and it is probably true. So the magazine asked the question, is God dead? And we come now to another sort of, well, I will call it in a second, ideology of the dead God. However, in my judgment, this title, this question, has a direct relation to the book by Daniel Bell about the end of ideologies, because well, many people were upset about this title, of course, in the 60s when it was published. They continue to be upset in the posterior decades up to our days. However, I believe that there is nothing, well, at least from my perspective, there is nothing to be upset about in this title, because effectively this title, this publication, this issue of the magazine proclaimed the same end of the God who was shaped by ideologies, or the God who was encaged into ideologies, or the God who served ideologies. Because people of the post-war period had this bad memories, had this bad feeling about the churches working with or collaborating with bad regimes, with inhuman ideologies. They refused this kind of religion, this kind of God who served ideologies. And I believe that this question addressed primarily this bad collaboration between religion, churches and ideologies. And this issue of the Time magazine actually put the full stop to this story of collaboration between old-fashioned ideologies, the ideologies of the era of modernity with the churches. Again, let us remember Evgeny Schwartz and his tale about the dragon and the dragon hunters. The moment you want to kill the dragon, or you kill the dragon, you turn to dragon yourself. So the dragon of the old-fashioned ideologies was killed. That was stated by Daniel Bell, by the Time magazine in 1966. What happened next? What happened to the dragon killer who had killed this ideology? Well, whatever happened to all dragon killers? They turned to dragons. And we, after that period, we probably deal with another iteration of ideologies. This time they are not ideologies of modernity that flourished in the 19th century, but they are the ideologies of postmodernity. Well, I believe firmly in the value of postmodernity, to be honest, and I think that postmodernity played a very important role, and this role can be appreciated only in the context of the overcoming the old-fashioned ideologies. Postmodernity emerged, well, it emerged in the beginning of the 20th century, but it became particularly popular in the after-war period, and exactly in order to tackle the issue of the old ideologies. The ideological mindset, the belief in very simple ideas, absolute belief in the ideas which are relative, relative, they are not absolute, but the absolute belief in those ideas led the humankind to the tragedies of the World War II. Postmodernists tried to deconstruct this absolute belief in relative ideas. And that's where I think it was the power of postmodern attitude. However, as a dragon killer, it faced the fate of what it haunted to become another kind of ideology. And we know these ideologies as the ones that contribute to the modern phenomenon, the phenomenon of culture wars. I usually ask my students in California, what are culture wars? The American society is very profoundly affected by culture wars. And they begin explaining me that they have to do with, oh, thank you so much. Oh, thank you. They begin explaining me about wars and culture and stuff like that. I answer to them, culture wars have nothing to do neither with war nor with culture. It's completely different. It's essentially a struggle between two ideological approaches. In the American context, it is Republicans and Democrats, or if you want, conservatives and liberals, and essentially it is a struggle between ideologies. Fortunately, because of the very essence of postmodernism, it could not lead to a war, this kind of struggle, because postmodernism doesn't believe even in wars, for good probably. And still, even in this new iteration, ideologies, I believe, they inspire churches. They subscribe churches to the sides of the battle. In the modern American situation, where the culture wars are really strong, they're at the brink of becoming a new war, literally. Like, for instance, when in 2016, when Trump was to be elected, many people, Democrats, were afraid that if Trump is not elected, then people, say in Texas, would go out to streets with their guns, and it could be just another outburst of war. Some people explain the culture war in the United States nowadays as a sort of continuation or rebirth of the Civil War, in a sense. The Civil War never stopped; it just came back in the form of the culture wars, which are organized by ideologies. The Civil War was about slavery, essentially, about real thing, human condition. It was also, the culture was also about economy to a great extent, because if you take this American South, it relied very much on slaves, because the slaves constitute the backbone of the economy. If you remove slavery, you just destroy the entire region, and they were protecting the economy, the social structure, their customs, everything. Nowadays, it's a different kind of civil war. It's about ideas, it's about attitudes, it's about what constitutes the core of the postmodern era. Therefore, yes, we now face another iteration of ideology, of the development of ideologies, and we have another kind of conflict between those ideologies. Fortunately, so far they are not bloody. But they are tense, and they can lead to outbursts of violence. And a feature of this conflict just followed it, and I would like to move to, or to maybe to try to think about the present situation. Are we still in the period of these postmodern ideologies? Or we are dealing with something different? We are dealing with another iteration, the next iteration of the ideological evolution. I believe we face a new, fresh stage of the ideological development. And a mark of this ideological development is a phenomenon which we know as post-truth nowadays. We know that in 2016 the Oxford dictionaries defined the word post-truth as the word of the year. And I believe that this new stage of ideological development, when people tried to deal with the bad sides of postmodernism, they tried to overcome postmodernism, they were fed up with it, and they wanted something new, and they produced and they wanted to deal with this relativization which was brought by postmodernism, and they essentially tried to deal with the dragon of postmodern ideologies. And they arrived at a new dragon. They gave birth to a new dragon of an iteration which I would call metamodern. Some people ponder if we could speak about postmodern stage in ideological development, or some people call it also meta-modern stage of ideological development. I think there is a grain of truth in this, and I believe that the new stage of ideological development features this new iteration. What is its main point? Its main point is that yes, we cannot relativize everything. Relativization of everything, deconstruction of everything is not helpful. But what we produce instead? We produce instead, we come back to the old ideologies of modernity, with the whole ideas, with the whole worldviews, which we perceive not anymore in the same absolute way as people perceived those ideological complexes, systems in the first half of the 20th century, for instance. But we try to play with them. We try to play with them as we are not dealing with them seriously, as they are toys, but that is the way how we promote our own attitudes, our own ideas, our own ideological worldviews. I would say it is a postmodern, relativized way of promotion of holistic, very modernist ideological systems. That is a sort of a feature of meta-modernity or postmodernity. That is, if you want, a feature of post-truth. Post-truth is when I take absolutely my own relative, my own very conditional attitude to truth. I don't like something, therefore I don't believe in it. I don't accept it as a fact. I accept only what I like. I accept only what I want. I absolutize my own attitude, and I relativize the attitude of others to what I believe. So this is a mix of postmodern relativization and modern absolutization. I absolutize my emotions, my attitude. I don't care about others, what other people think about this. I'm absolutely happy about what I believe, even if it does not stand truth. That is what Trump has called alternative facts. So I'm absolutely fine if my facts are alternative to the mainstream, widely accepted, fact proven, and so forth. Well, this is a kind of phenomenon that the West has been facing since 2016, at least, since the elections in the United States. But in Ukraine, we have faced the same phenomenon since we have been facing it since 2014, at least. That is a thing that we first faced, and this wave of post-truth, of meta-modernity, if you want, it came from Russia to Ukraine, and it first tried to swallow Ukraine. Of course, we did not, I remember myself, try to figure out what is going on in Ukraine in 2014, try to articulate what kind of propaganda it is, what sort of wording, what sort of mechanisms of pursuing people were used. Well, we called it propaganda, we called it manipulations, and so forth. Now we have a much better language to describe this, including the language of post-truth and those reflections that have appeared in the works of the Western thinkers. We were discussing during the dinner today Tim Snyder's work on the crisis of the Western democracy, and this is a good way to explain the same thing that we try to explain in Ukraine. And actually, Tim Snyder himself, he first tried to explain this phenomenon in application to Ukraine, and then he was forced to apply the same language to describe Trump's America, quite surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly. So I believe that this turn in ideological evolution from postmodern ideologies, two metamodern ideologies, marked exactly the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And I would interpret the Russian war against Ukraine exactly in these terms. What they tried to do, they tried to play with the war, effectively. Remember, one of the protagonists of the Russian aggression, Igor Girkin, he was himself an animator. He played, the officers of the Tsar's army in the battlefield. They reconstructed battlefields of the World War I, World War II, whatever, and they began with playing in war and ended up with real war. However, for them it was still a play, it was still a game. Probably, well, some of you know about this. I like this comparison. Probably you know this computer game by Microsoft, Civilization, where you play with civilizations. That's what the Russians tried to do in Ukraine. They took this concept of civilization. They tried to protect their own civilization. They invented, first of all, their own civilization of the Russian world. And they tried to play with it as if it was a game. For many it was a game, but it ended up very badly with human deaths and losses and so forth. But still, if you take the ideologies of the Russian world, people like, if I may take, for instance, the church side of this phenomenon, like Father Vsevolod Chaplin, who is a notorious kind of speaker on behalf of the Russian world. He just yesterday, I think, or today, made a statement that Crimea is not enough for Russia. Russia should occupy Kiev. That was his fresh kind of statement. He's a postmodernist to the core of his mind. He always was a postmodern kind of guy. And he ended up in this sort of ideology which is now postmodern. And that's exactly, for me, it's a personification of this new iteration of ideologies. When people play with ideas as if they were postmodernists, but they are ready to kill for the sake of those games. And that is what is happening in Russia, I believe. And in the end, I just want to pose a few questions for you and for us to discuss. And I will try very briefly to answer those questions. So, just like in the case of modernist ideologies, which led to the great wars in Europe, the church collaborated with those ideologies. The church was infected. Well, I mean, the churches in general, even the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches, the Orthodox churches, all of them in Europe, they, to different extents, they collaborated with those ideologies, were affected by them. They were affected also by postmodern ideologies. They got trapped in two culture wars. If you take the United States, well, my impression of the Catholic Church in the United States, it is that it is very deeply entrenched in the culture wars. It is an intrinsic, it does not separate itself from the culture wars, maybe except Jesuits. They stay kind of sane and healthy. The same are the evangelicals, who effectively they committed this this original sin of the Constantinian Symphony with the present American establishment. The Orthodox do the same. They are deeply involved in the culture wars of the American setting. Then we have, if we accept this hypothesis about metamodern iteration of ideology, then we see how the church collaborated, contributed, and even inspired the wars that were resulted by this ideology, like in Ukraine. The Russian church is very much behind this Russian aggression. So my question is, can we avoid this virtual circle? Can we get away from it?
You have 1 minute.
Yes, and this is exactly will be my question. Can we avoid this engagement into ideology the churches. Not at the expense of isolation from society, because this would be the easiest way, just to cut off ourselves from any social developments and just hide ourselves in the caves and forget about the society. That will be the safest way to, to get away from ideology. It is the same effective way as if you have a headache, the best medicine for the headache is guillotine. That would be the treatment of this ideology. So what would be the solution to get away from ideologies? Well, 30 seconds answer. My answer to this question is secularization. I believe that secularization in the sense of separation between the church and the state would be a good solution, would be a step towards that. The church needs to keep away from the state, because the state is the main source of this infection of ideology. Second is, I believe, is repentance for the church, for those crimes that it had committed when it collaborated with bad ideologies. And the third solution would be probably, the main difference between ideology and theology is that ideology looks at the things of this world. Theology looks at the things beyond this world. So keep an eye on the metaphysical, on the transcendental, on what is beyond this world, is another way away from ideology. And the rest I invite you to discuss in the Q&A. Thank you.
And he answered me within 1 hour. Within 1 hour. I will write this. Yes, yes. Yeah. Interesting times, this Chinese.